Pope Francis, born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Buenos Aires, Argentina in 1936, passed away on April 21, 2025, at the age of 88. He had been battling chronic lung disease for decades, having had part of his right lung removed in his youth. In February 2025, he was hospitalized for a respiratory crisis that developed into double pneumonia, marking his longest hospitalization during his 12-year papacy. Despite his health challenges, Pope Francis remained active in his duties. He made his last public appearance on Easter Sunday, April 20, 2025, delivering the Urbi et Orbi blessing from St. Peter's Square. The following morning, he passed away quietly in his residence at the Santa Marta Guest House in Vatican City. The news of Pope Francis's death reverberated around the globe, drawing tributes from world leaders, religious figures, and millions of faithful. His tenure as the first Latin American pope was marked by humility, a focus on social justice, and efforts to reform the church. He appointed a significant number of cardinals from the global south, reflecting his commitment to a more inclusive church. In New York City, St. Patrick's Cathedral held a special mass in his honor, with Cardinal Timothy Dolan praising his compassionate leadership. In Buenos Aires, his hometown, thousands gathered in Plaza de Mayo to remember a man who had once walked among them as a humble priest. Across continents, people lit candles and offered prayers, celebrating his legacy of peace and service. As per Vatican protocol, the period following the Pope's death is known as sede vacante, the vacant seat. During this time, Cardinal Kevin Farrell, the Camerlengo, assumes administrative duties. He confirmed the Pope's death, sealed his residence, and ensured the destruction of the Fisherman's Ring and Papal Seal to prevent misuse. A 9-day mourning period, known as Novendiale, commenced, with masses held in St. Peter's Basilica. Pope Francis had requested a simplified funeral to be held in St. Mary Major Basilica in Rome, near an icon of the Madonna. He also requested to be buried in a simple wooden casket, foregoing the traditional display of his body on a raised platform. Meanwhile, preparations for the papal conclave began. Cardinals under the age of 80, known as cardinal electors, were expected to gather in Rome to elect a new pope. The conclave was scheduled to begin between May 6th and 11th, 2025, in the Sistine Chapel. The days following Pope Francis's death were filled with somber reflection and intense anticipation. The Vatican, draped in mourning, buzzed with preparations for the conclave, the sacred and secretive process by which the next pope would be chosen. Cardinals from across the globe arrived in Rome, many of whom had served alongside Pope Francis during his papacy. Some had been close to him, others less so, but all shared a deep reverence for the man who had guided the church through times of immense change and turbulence. The conclave was set to begin in early May. It would take place in the Sistine Chapel, where the cardinals would be locked in seclusion, cut off from the outside world until a new pope was chosen. The air was thick with anticipation as the cardinals arrived one by one, their solemn expressions a reflection of the gravity of the task before them. Many had already begun discussing the qualities they hoped the next pope would possess. A visionary, leader who could navigate the growing divide within the church, a beacon of hope for the world's poorest, and someone who would continue Pope Francis's mission of social justice, peace, and inclusivity. As they gathered, it was clear that the decision would not be an easy one. The church stood at a crossroads, with some factions calling for a return to more traditional practices, while others pushed for continued reform. The outcome of this conclave would shape the future of the Catholic Church for generations to come. The stakes had never been higher. Inside the Sistine Chapel, the cardinals took their oaths, pledging to uphold the secrecy of the conclave and to choose the man whom they believed was most suited to lead the church. The towering fresco of Michelangelo's Creation of Adam loomed above them, a reminder of the divine nature of the task at hand. As the cardinals filed into the chapel and the doors were sealed behind them, the world outside waited with bated breath. The conclave unfolded over several days. Each day, the cardinals gathered in the Sistine Chapel, casting their ballots in secrecy. The tension in the chapel was palpable. The future of the church weighed heavily on each vote. With every round of voting, the cardinals deliberated, prayed, and reflected on what Pope Francis had meant to the world and what the church needed in his successor. Throughout the process, names were whispered among the cardinals. Some believed the next pope should be someone who could bridge the gaps between the conservative and progressive factions of the church. Others argued for a leader who could continue the reformist agenda that Pope Francis had championed. The cardinals knew that Pope Francis's death had left a void in the hearts of many, and they were determined to elect someone who could offer the same kind of leadership that had transformed the church in his time. Outside, the world waited for signs of progress. The faithful gathered in St. Peter's Square, praying for a swift and inspired decision. The crowds were a mixture of hope and sorrow, their faith in the process unwavering, even as the days stretched on. Each day, the smoke from the Sistine Chapel's chimney was carefully watched. Black smoke signaled that no pope had been elected, while white smoke would announce to the world that the church had a new leader. As the days passed, the cardinals grew more determined. The votes remained close, but it became increasingly clear that a frontrunner was emerging. Some believed that the church would look once again to the global south for leadership, continuing the legacy of Pope Francis as the first Latin American pope. Others thought a leader from Europe, particularly Italy, might bring stability and familiarity back to the Vatican. The news of Pope Francis's death will send waves of grief through every corner of the world. Vigils and memorial services will take place in major cities, from Buenos Aires to Rome, New York to Manila. In St. Peter's Square, millions will gather to pay their respects to the man who had been the spiritual guide for over 1 billion people for more than a decade. World leaders will express their sorrow, and messages of condolence will flood in, from people of all faiths. However, the mourning will not be just for the man, but also for the leadership vacuum he leaves behind. For many, Pope Francis was a symbol of hope and moral clarity, particularly in a time of growing division. His death will prompt questions about the future of the church, questions that cannot be answered immediately, but must be answered soon as the papal conclave is set to begin. In the days following his death, the Vatican will enter a period of sede vacante, the time when the papacy is vacant. During this period, the Camerlengo, Cardinal Kevin Farrell, will be responsible for overseeing the administration of the Vatican, ensuring that everything remains in order until a new pope is elected. The College of Cardinals, those eligible to vote in the conclave, will begin gathering in Rome as the world waits for the election that will decide the future direction of the Catholic Church. The atmosphere in the Vatican will be charged with anticipation and uncertainty. The cardinals, many of whom worked closely with Pope Francis, will be reflecting on his legacy, the reforms he pushed for, and the challenges he faced. The question that looms large: who will follow in his footsteps? Will the church continue the path of reform, or will it move toward a more traditional direction? The papal conclave, which will be held in early May 2025, will be the first such event since the election of Pope Francis in 2013. It will be a historic moment as cardinals from all over the world gather to decide who will lead the church through the next phase of its existence. The conclave will take place in the Sistine Chapel, where the cardinals will be sequestered from the outside world until a new pope is chosen. The doors of the chapel will be sealed, and only the black or white smoke from the chimney will signal the outcome of each vote. The election process will be deeply emotional. The cardinals will reflect on Pope Francis's legacy, his efforts to address the global challenges of poverty, inequality, and climate change, and they will also grapple with the division that some believe still exists within the church. The next pope will have the delicate task of continuing the work that Pope Francis began, while also addressing the concerns of those who feel that his reforms went too far. Though it is difficult to predict who the next pope will be, speculation will mount in the weeks leading up to the conclave. Several cardinals from the global south, particularly from Africa and Latin America, will be seen as strong candidates. These regions have seen immense growth in Catholicism in recent decades, and many believe that the next pope must come from one of these areas to maintain the global reach and inclusivity that Pope Francis worked so hard to foster. The conclave will be a closely watched event as the world waits for a new pope to be chosen. The election will not just be about selecting a new leader for the Church, but about deciding the direction the Church will take in the face of modern challenges. The cardinals will debate the need for continuity with Pope Francis's vision, while also considering the future of the Vatican and the broader Catholic community. When the new pope is finally elected, the world will be watching with great anticipation, eager to see how he will lead the Church in the aftermath of Pope Francis's death. The election will be a moment of great importance as the Church prepares to enter a new era. The coronation of the new pope will be a solemn event, full of tradition, yet tinged with the emotional weight of Pope Francis's passing. As the conclave progresses, the cardinals gather in the Sistine Chapel each day to cast their votes. The air is thick with reverence, but also with tension. With every round of voting, it becomes clear that the Church is at a crossroads. Some of the older cardinals, who have long adhered to traditional Church teachings, push for a return to a more conservative direction. They argue that the reforms Pope Francis championed were too radical for many, particularly in the Western world, and that the Church needs a more cautious and steadfast figure to lead it through the turbulent waters of modernity. However, many of the younger cardinals, especially those from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, feel a deep responsibility to continue the work that Pope Francis began. They advocate for a leader who will remain committed to social justice, care for the poor, and environmental advocacy. The debate among the cardinals is not just theological but deeply personal, as many are still mourning the loss of a man who inspired them to serve a world in desperate need of compassion. Day after day, the cardinals meet in secrecy, casting their ballots in the hope of finding consensus. Their deliberations are heated, and the process of voting is painstaking. The ballots are counted, and after each round, the anticipation grows. Black smoke billows from the Sistine Chapel chimney, signaling that no decision has been reached yet. But with every vote, the field narrows, and it becomes clear that one name is emerging as the frontrunner. Cardinal Mateo Rivera, a respected and experienced leader from Colombia, begins to gain significant traction among the cardinals. Known for his diplomatic skill and deep spirituality, Rivera has been a close ally of Pope Francis in the past and is seen as someone who can continue the path of reform while also uniting the divided factions within the Church. He is not seen as a radical, but rather as a steady hand who can navigate the complexities of the modern world with grace and wisdom. Finally, after several intense days of voting, the white smoke rises from the Sistine Chapel chimney. The cardinals have reached their decision. A new pope has been chosen. The crowd in St. Peter's Square erupts in applause, the air heavy with emotion. This will be a new beginning for the Catholic Church, but also a time to reflect on the legacy left behind by Pope Francis. As the new pope emerges onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, a wave of relief and anticipation sweeps over the crowd gathered in St. Peter's Square. The face of Cardinal Mateo Rivera, now known as Pope Mateo I, appears calm but visibly moved by the weight of the responsibility he has just inherited. The millions of eyes watching from around the world see not just a man in white robes, but the symbol of the Church's continuity and its future. Pope Mateo's first words to the crowd are simple, but they resonate deeply. He speaks of his gratitude to the cardinals for entrusting him with this sacred duty and promises to follow in the footsteps of Pope Francis, while also acknowledging the challenges that lie ahead. His voice is steady, yet filled with humility, and as he speaks, it's clear that he has already begun to chart the path forward. "I stand before you," Pope Matteo says, "not as a leader above you, but as a servant of the people, chosen by God to carry the light of the Church into a world that so desperately needs it. Together, we will continue the work that Pope Francis began, spreading love, justice, and peace to every corner of the earth." The faithful, who had gathered from all corners of the globe, erupt in applause, their cheers echoing through the square. The moment is electric, full of hope, but also marked by the recognition that the Church will face many challenges in the coming years. Pope Matteo, like Pope Francis before him, will have to lead a global church that is struggling to reconcile tradition with the demands of a rapidly changing world. As Pope Matteo steps back into the shadows of the balcony, the world watches in anticipation of the changes that will unfold under his papacy. Will he continue Pope Francis's reforms, or will he chart a new course, navigating the delicate balance between tradition and innovation? In the days following his election, Pope Matteo's coronation will take place in a ceremony that is steeped in tradition, yet marked by simplicity, a hallmark of Pope Francis's legacy. The coronation is not the extravagant event it once was, but a solemn, deeply spiritual occasion that reflects the priorities of the new pope. The papal coronation, as always, will take place in St. Peter's Basilica, but this time, the atmosphere is far less ceremonious than in the past. Pope Matteo has chosen a more subdued form of inauguration, one that mirrors his own approach to leadership. The solemn Mass of installation will be attended by thousands of faithful from around the world, including dignitaries, heads of state, and of course, the cardinals who helped elect him. The ceremony will begin with Pope Matteo being presented with the pallium, a woolen stole symbolizing his authority as the shepherd of the Church. It will be placed around his shoulders by the Dean of the College of Cardinals, a moment that marks his official entry into the role of Pope. He will then kneel before the altar, a gesture of humility, acknowledging the weight of the task ahead of him. His heart will be heavy, not with the grandeur of the moment, but with the immense responsibility that the papacy carries. After the Mass, Pope Matteo will emerge once again onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, where he will give his first papal blessing as Pope Matteo I. It will be a moment filled with emotion, both for the new pope and for the faithful who have waited so long for this new chapter in the Church's history. But as he raises his hand to bless the crowd, there will be a moment of silence, a collective breath, as the world stands at the threshold of a new era. Pope Matteo will be a leader, yes, but he will also be a servant, and in his first papal blessing, it will be clear that the journey ahead will not be easy, but it will be a journey marked by hope, compassion, and unity.